Hello. Thank you for checking out my talk. My name is Seth Hudson. I'm Associate Professor of Game Writing at George Mason University in our Computer Game Design program. And today I'm going to talk to you about, approaching the pedagogy of game writing. So first off, my background. I've been at Mason now in some capacity since 2010, but my earliest experiences as an educator were in the English composition classroom. As a grad student, doing literature and playwriting, it was sort of part of the deal. As time went on, I became more of a writer myself as I was teaching writing. Eventually went into a PhD program in education to, become a researcher. Kind of odd that I've ended up now being a teaching, writing researcher with this project. Really the culmination of all of those different things coming together. But first of all, pedagogy. Some people say pedagogy. Before every conference, every 6 to 12 months, I freak out and make sure I'm pronouncing this word correctly. There's no right way. Ironically, it's really just a fancy way to say teaching or instruction. And so please don't be scared off by that word, because we teach and instruct in lots of different ways, both in the classroom and elsewhere. Boom. So assumptions. I like to get started with these. You're going to meet me now for, 27 more minutes. But to let you know where I'm coming from, some of these things might seem simple, but basically instructors are vital in developing effective pedagogy. Effective pedagogy relies on more than just personal expertise. And then finally, effective, well-established practices from other disciplines. And in many, many cases, they've been around longer than computer game design as a field of study in higher ed, that we can and should lean on those. So assumption one, instructors at the center. So this might seem, it's definitely self-serving. You're looking at me talk while there's a picture of me in my stereotypical corduroy blazer up there on the screen. But this is important to keep in mind. As the people serving the students, the people in the classroom, the people developing the coursework, designing the curricula, it really is important that we don't lose sight of the value of the instructor and the buy-in. Rather than constantly chasing trends in the industry or one of my least favorite things, developing courses or even whole programs that are essentially just there to market to get more students in the door. Really remembering that as educators with lots of experience, we already have a wealth of knowledge. And as the people implementing this curriculum, we can't forget that. Assumption two, effective pedagogy evolves. After a while, you may find yourself teaching the same class over and over again. For me, that's been Game 332, Story Design for Computer Games, RS. I've taught the course since 2010. Didn't really know what to do when I started, changed it up every semester, still do, right? But when we evolve, we allow ourselves to, A, keep it fresh. We're people too. We're not teaching robots. But B, to actually, not just be pie in the sky. Like if I could teach them everything I wanted to and had access and all the time, that would be terrific. But we have to be practical and we have to evolve and make choices and edit what we do. Assumption three, effective instructors should engage established disciplines. And again, I don't know if it wasn't obvious to me. It took a while. I was chasing this new thing, right? Games are this frontier in storytelling. The stuff I did decades ago in graduate school was just boring. It was stuff I had to do. After a while, I saw the relevance and I realized today to really think about what got you, if you are an educator, what got you to higher ed in the first place. Maybe your background is in traditional art. Maybe it's in programming. Maybe it's in something completely different. What was it that helped you learn. And there's a chance there's more to that than you realize at first. But so arriving at a topic, I was told that it's completely natural to take a sip of water. Water. So at first, I was overly ambitious, as many researchers. I wanted this 20,000-foot view of computer game design, this novel field of study. So I tried and failed many times. And I want to give you a little bit of a rundown. This was my in memoriam list. So the first research project I wanted to do, and I, went through all the steps through IRB, had to recruit people, sit them down. I was interested in literature. I was sure that the classics and that contemporary fiction and drama, that there was something there that game design students, regardless of their specialty, that they needed to know. It was great. I got to have some really cool conversations with people that I recorded and spent hours transcribing. Nothing really came out of that, nothing useful. So the next step was to try and get a cross section to find out what we should really be teaching students. And when I say that, the belief that the technology is always changing, right? And it's hard to keep up with. But what are those core, those higher order thinking skills? And what does that mean in context? And so went around, recruited, actually got travel money to go to some conferences. Lots of opinions. None of them very useful for students. And so then finally, it's sort of as a result, I ended up, wanting to find out, well, what do the folks in the industry think we teach students? I was concerned about the value of a computer game design degree. And so, sought that out, just sort of off the tops of your heads. And again, that was really just frustrating. So, took a step back, big breath, kind of like that drink of water that was so natural. I wanted to define my purpose. Why do I want to do this? Why do I care? It really was a concern for the students. The idea that students, at least our students in the U.S., incur all kinds of debt and hardship that comes as a result of taking on a college education. And I feel a solemn responsibility, as I think, or at least hope most of you do, to make sure there's value there, right? That it's not just a piece of paper at the end if they jump through all the hoops. So with that purpose, and kind of thinking back on what do I know? Well, I know writing, and I know writing research. So I took a step back, and how can I use those tools that people in the field of writing studies, how can I use those to get a better understanding of game writing? And for me, in particular, that's the one thing I teach at that time. I teach other things now. But so how can I learn about that and do that better? So looking at the literature was great. And that gave me a framework. And the literature didn't come from the game design standpoint. The literature actually came from things like rhetorical genre studies and activity theory, and just, things from education, things that don't talk about game design at all, except that they actually are talking about game design. They just don't realize it. And so I took that and decided to engage practitioners. Again, rather than get a full swath in this giant sample size, I'm going to try and find writers, and just game writers. So went through your basic steps that you do, learned about their experiences. It was kind of that simple at first. So what I came up with were these areas of competence. So what are areas of competence? So basically, this just all centers around, I'll sum it up. Writing instruction should focus on what we want students to do, not what we want them to know. A lot of times, if you're, an old hand at higher ed, you know about writing your student learning outcomes. We know about using verbs that are active and the, Bloom's taxonomy, but really just that simple. We have the luxury really in the writing classroom to be creating the stuff. It's not like, there aren't many things that are completely out of the scope, out of the realm of possibility. But so these functional competencies, which I just like that name better, I like to call them fun comps. It was an interesting discovery because I was hoping, in sort of that traditional qualitative research standpoint, I did interviews, I recorded them, I transcribed them, I used NVivo, the software for coding at different points, and I really was looking for keywords and phrases. Other than writing skills, which ironically few people defined, even as I teased them out in interviews, it really came down to these broad areas. And just PS, one side note, relying on the sort of clip art icons here from PowerPoint, I love how understanding players gave us a shopping cart. Immediately, we're jumping to like marketing. Anyway, so why these fun comps? They were malleable. And as a result, accurate, because the game writers in my study didn't really have a typical day. And I didn't think that they would, right? And few of us do in our jobs. If we're going to be quite honest about it, we might be a little precious. But so having these larger categories, yes, they were just the result of how do I, get something out of all this. But it really confirmed there's really no one thing like game writing, because game writing has to shift and be agile. And then I also realized, and as I see my typo, but I'm just going to live with that, it allows instructor freedom and effectiveness. Again, relying on your experience as an instructor and understanding that, meeting for 15 weeks for 150 minutes a week comes out to less than 40 hours, which I love. It's like, ironically, I think an hour or an hour and a half short of being a full work week. That's all the time you get in the classroom. But it lets anyone that might have a different, slightly different background, a slightly different expertise, it allows them to know that they're still serving the students in something relevant to game writing and to narrative design, but doing it in an effective way with what they know how to teach, rather than just prescribing something. I also like it because it allows us to assess meaningfully. I think it's a time for us as educators to take more seriously how we demonstrate our effectiveness. We spend a lot of time getting excited about our own work and theorizing what we should teach these students because we're passionate about it. Many of us take the next step to how. How do we go about teaching that? That third step of how do we know it worked, a lot of us don't get to. And so keeping assessment in mind when you're designing these things is very helpful. So now I'm going to touch on, I'm going to touch on these functional competencies, these areas of competence. And the first one, maybe a little obvious, writing and storytelling. But this is a myth that you have to dispel many times in games, right? And particularly with our students. Writing is about more than just having ideas, right? The ins and outs of taking something and understanding that writing is a process and many drafts and feedback, workshops, all of those things. It doesn't come natural at first. Many students, will view it as, here's the prompt. What am I going to get graded on? They submit it and they hope for a grade. And if it's good, they're magically a good writer. Seizing the opportunities to practice elsewhere. Not everything has to be its own special class. And so if I have a student that is really passionate about writing, and they've taken all the things that we offer in our department, and part of that has to do with space and, our workforce, whatever. Well, guess what? We have an excellent film program. We have an excellent drama program that has playwriting. We have an English department that has fiction, even nonfiction, poetry, all of these things, but identifying places where students can get what they need, knowing that, it's not exactly, implementing writing into a game, but they're still building those skills. Lastly, enforcing standards, and this is, I don't, this rubs people the wrong way, but at least in our curriculum, there's lots of writing. People write pitch documents, game design docs, or it might just be an analysis or review of a game or something like that. If we don't have rigor, and we end up rewarding that, what I'll call bad behavior, right? Mind you, I understand that grammar and mechanics is a construct, and that's a very complicated thing for another day. But we might teach students unwittingly that, just throwing down an idea is good enough. And then writing becomes subjective. And we really know, well, it's not. We want to be our own best critics. But I digress. Into another drink. Communication and collaboration, not just buzzwords. Doing this with our students really comes through reflection. The idea of, why do some people groan when you say, hey, we're going to break up into groups for this one? What experiences are good, which are bad? How can you describe these things? But if we get them in that reflective mindset, it deepens the learning. There's research to back that up, just in general. But it deepens those experiences, even though they're like little microcosms of these college classes, and it's, a safe environment. It gives them those tools to be able to kind of roll with those punches later. Collaborative writing is vastly different than some of those traditional media that we just discussed that we could possibly lean on. Providing models, again, is very important. This is where something like activity theory for me came in, to sort of use that to present things to students to kind of visualize how all these different pieces interact. But when it's just a buzzword, it's just one of those successory posters with the picture of a bald eagle or something, it's wasted, right? When we get to the core, it comes down to emotional intelligence, right? Intellectual empathy, or just plain old empathy, which is something good to teach our students anyway. Getting them to really try and understand other folks and where they're coming from. And so, yes, kumbaya, that's great. More peaceful, verdant society. But writers need to be able to do that anyway, to understand characters and to inhabit situations and think about motivations. And so if we can take communication and collaboration from more than just teamwork and make it into something a little more meaningful that has to do with people, it's going to be more useful. Systems and dynamics. When writing, many folks have that idea in their head, and one day I'm sure I'm going to get there, where I'm going to have like a big old puffy sweater. I'm going to be sitting on a lake someplace in New Hampshire, writing my masterpiece all alone, nothing else happening. It's not really going to work that way. Having our writing students understand where systems and dynamics come into play, and this gets a little tough, right? There might be a belief that we want to break free of these, the hierarchy, the power structures within game development, at least at the AAA level. And that's great, right? I would argue the first step there is understanding how those work, rather than just, I couldn't possibly engage in that, I'm going to be an indie. But really try and isolate where individuals exist to know where we can exist. But two, to appreciate then that it's not just you in that system. There are many different yous, a flock of sheep, I guess, unintentionally. But looking, activities and things that allow students a chance to realize that sometimes they may be using their skills to generate new content. Sometimes they may just be, writing, PR or box copy or something like that. But understanding that system of all the things and how they relate, and it's easier said than done, but that's an absolute key. Tool proficiency, this is the last one, and I'll say the understanding dynamics and systems. Both of these really, I think, tie more closely to folks that aren't as directly engaged in game development. Many students that aren't necessarily game design students. They do something else. They're writers. They just love games. But this idea that we're not looking for students to master a particular software, right? That what they need to do to be successful is to be flexible, to be able to pick something up rather quickly. So if we can instill that willingness to self-teach, that is it's so valuable, right? How do we assess that? I don't know. But part of it is making students deal with lack of, I guess a lack of comfort. There's not always a right way. There's usually good and bad. And so, having them do work that they embrace is original. And yes, you're using this particular tool, but we don't want you to just fill in a form and find a template and do that exact same thing. We want you to play around with it. We want you to be a tinkerer. And just personally, as an instructor, it's a real pleasure sometimes, right? To see what students come up with. Other places to work on this besides just the game design or game writing class, anything where you have to learn a tool or you have to learn how to do your recording for your big conference. But thinking of the statistics program, SPSS, or the coding software that I used, and Vivo, those were not intuitive at all. But you have to figure it out to move forward. Finally, understanding play and understanding players. There's an assumption, I didn't put it on the list at the beginning, but a student is interested in pursuing game writing because they themselves are interested in games. Likely at some point they enjoyed a game. They were passionate about one. A lot of times they don't know why. Or in some cases, they'll have very strong reactions to something they don't like. I always point out that someone does. Right? That's popular for a reason. It might not be a good reason, but really trying to understand what makes different kinds of players tick. And I don't even, I misspoke. I don't even like kinds of players. Just why does anyone like particular stuff? That really starts with understanding via accessing prior knowledge. Why do you play what you play? Why do you like it? We have to be able to do that if we want to try and emulate, isolate those different techniques, those different qualities, and make them our own in some way. Sort of just going from being a consumer to, maybe like a connoisseur in the middle to eventually a creator. So to kind of sum it up, that was a lot about those 5 areas. The writing and storytelling, anything you can give students where they practice craft. Where they have to write, things in a short amount of time, or they have to go through multiple drafts and really appreciate that process. Communication and collaboration for game writers, anything that complicates authorship, right? Students that work on a piece that they didn't start and they're not going to finish, right? Or, switching up teams and roles, something like that in the middle. Having them reflect on that process. Was that hard? Sure. Why was it hard? What can that tell you about yourself and your process? Understanding systems and dynamics, genre knowledge. And when I say genre there, I mean very specifically rhetorical genre, concept from composition and writing studies that I rely heavily on. Tool proficiency, any writing they do outside of word processing is important. And remember, not every text is alphabetical. That's a different talk for a different day. And then understanding play. I don't need to talk about game studies to this crowd. So valuable, right? Really breaking things down to their essence, looking at the culture that surrounds games. There's a wealth of knowledge out there. These are all things that the game writer needs. They must have. Okay. Essential roles. This is the sort of the next piece that allows me to tie these things together. But we're looking at the wordsmith, sense maker, and advocate. These are the different roles at different times where these beautiful, our 5 areas of competence, our fun comps. These are the ways that those are all deployed. This can be very useful when we're not just thinking about courses in game writing, but when we're thinking about the larger curriculum. But so tying it all together, or at least attempting to, looking at these functional competencies, but then, what different coursework or, sequence of courses or even workshops and things. Not everything has to be a course. But what can we do to allow students a way to practice and refine those different functional competencies as these different things, as that sense maker who's trying to make something fit that doesn't really fit, or that wordsmith that just has to crank out, 20 pages of barks for "arg, he shot me," or that advocate, the person who has to make decisions and has to really help incorporate the knowledge and understanding of their team and their project in order to know what ideas need to be, and I hate, the fighting for, right, choosing your battles. I hate that. I'll say choosing your meals. You don't want to fill up, right? Sometimes you want to wait until the next day because tacos are on the menu. I'll have to play around with that one a little bit, but you can fill in these particulars. I was really focused on game writing specifically. I engaged game writers in the industry, but ended up, I came up with this framework. So that allows you to, really, rather than try and nail down specific things, and we end up with these 5 courses students have to take, and maybe we realize that, well, they can't actually take them because of their schedules, or maybe they're a transfer student and they're going to have to add time to their degree. If we can be flexible and we can see where these different things can happen, that's really going to help. I'll say too, just to touch on this rigor thing, we should assess student learning. We can fall in love with our own ideas. We can rely on our charisma in the classroom, our students just being in awe that they get to be in college studying something like game design or, writing stories for games. We have to keep in mind that at the end of the day, we need to be able to assess, are they learning what we hope they're learning? We kind of have to get over ourselves a little bit in order to do that. And so when we don't have that rigor for ourselves and our students, we get in trouble. So one more note, I came up with wordsmith, that idea, someone that might have to do anything with words at any time. But then, thinking about within curriculum development. And these are older numbers from the HEVGA survey back in 2015. And I imagine this is still the case. We don't have a lot of uniformity across our various programs, and that's okay, right? But if we take that Smith thing and we take out word, right? I start to feel like this framework can apply to lots of different things. That if we can consider our courses and our curricula, this idea of these different roles that can rotate, and we're kind of doing our individual little skills, our smithing to different degrees, that can really help us. So why just approaching pedagogy? Well, my assumptions. I believe we must continue to evolve. By leveraging past experiences, engaging other disciplines, and holding ourselves accountable, we can continue to improve instruction. And as a result, we'll sophisticate the field of study and ultimately the medium. Ooh, that was my time. This was fun. So thank you. My name is Seth Hudson. Please send me an email if you'd like to know more about some of the things that I only sort of talked about but didn't. And have a great day.